If you've ever stood in a room full of people and still felt completely alone, you'll understand what that day felt like. My mother's funeral wasn't supposed to be about him, but somehow Ethan found a way to make even her death about his schedule. He said he had urgent meetings in Hawaii. That was his phrase for everything that didn't include me: urgent meetings. When the pastor called for family to speak, everyone looked around, expecting my husband to be beside me. His chair stayed empty. My aunt whispered, maybe his flight was delayed. But I knew better. Ethan never missed flights, only responsibilities. The room smelled like lilies and rain-soaked coats. People spoke in that quiet, polite tone you reserve for grief, but all I heard was the absence of his voice, the silence that felt louder than the music playing in the background. I stood near my mother's casket, trying to hold it together, while flashes from cell phones captured my face. One of them, I later learned, wasn't just a family friend, it was a local blogger. That's how the photo spread. Me in black, eyes red from crying, standing alone while the caption read, Seattle architect Claire Donovan attends her mother's funeral without her husband, real estate mogul Ethan Donovan, who's currently in Hawaii. And then the photo, Ethan shirtless, smiling with Vanessa Reed, his PR assistant, cocktail in hand. It took less than 12 hours for everyone in my world to know. I didn't even get to finish grieving before I became gossip. My phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from friends, coworkers, even reporters pretending to care about the emotional strength of women in the public eye. I didn't answer any of them. I just sat there, in the living room my mother designed herself, staring at the empty spot on the couch where Ethan used to sit when he pretended to be supportive. It's funny, in a dark kind of way, how betrayal doesn't come with thunder or warning. Sometimes it shows up in a text, a photo, or a quiet absence in a room where someone was supposed to stand next to you. By evening, the world had turned my life into a headline, and my husband was too busy sipping drinks on a beach to notice. The house felt heavier without my mother, but the silence wasn't mourning. It was anger beginning to breathe. At some point, Vanessa posted a picture of the two of them at a resort captioned, "Work-life balance." Finally, I remember staring at it, wondering if she laughed when she typed it. People always assume the worst part of betrayal is finding out. It's not. The worst part is realizing how ordinary it felt, how many small things you ignored because love made you polite. I poured myself a glass of water and saw my reflection in the window. I didn't look broken, just done pretending. That's the thing about grief. It burns through denial faster than fire through paper. When the phone rang again, I almost ignored it. Then I saw the name Margaret Ellis. My mother? It couldn't be. I froze, every part of me trying to make sense of something that wasn't supposed to happen. The call stopped before I answered, but the number stayed on the screen like it was mocking me. I pressed, call back. No answer, just silence. That's when I told myself it had to be a scam, someone found her old phone, maybe some automated thing. But my chest wouldn't stop tightening, because for one small, impossible second, I wanted to believe it was her. I turned off the lights, sat on the edge of the bed, and waited for sleep that didn't come. The world outside was quiet, but inside, everything had shifted. Something in me whispered that the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. Before we go on, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been betrayed by someone who was supposed to stand beside you when life got hard? Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you love true revenge and betrayal stories like this, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. Because that night, something happened that made the funeral look like the calm before the storm. The phone buzzed again around midnight, sharp enough to make me flinch. I reached for it without thinking. The same number flashed across the screen. Mom. My throat went dry. This time, it wasn't a call. It was a text. I'm not dead. Come to the house. Present. I stared at the words until they blurred. My brain tried to reason it out. Wrong number, cruel prank, spam, anything logical. But the house she mentioned, it was her old place in Portland, the one she hadn't lived in for years. Nobody outside the family knew that address. I sat there, the glow of the screen lighting up the room like a bad omen. Logic said stay put. Every other part of me said drive. By the time I grabbed my keys, rain had started, a thin drizzle that turned the street slick and quiet. Seattle to Portland isn't a long drive, but that night it felt endless. Every mile between cities felt like crossing through doubt. I parked in front of my mother's house around 2 a.m. The porch light was on. She always left it on when I was driving home late. My heart kicked so hard I thought I might throw up. The door wasn't locked. Inside smelled like dust and something faintly floral, like her favorite candle from years ago. I called out her name, my voice cracking halfway through. No answer. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to fill the silence. Then I saw it, the small lamp by her armchair still glowing. On the coffee table sat a single envelope with my name written in her handwriting. The kind of cursive schools stopped teaching years ago. For a moment, I couldn't move. My mother's handwriting always looked calm, like the kind of woman who never lost control. Seeing it again felt like someone had reached through time just to test my sanity. The envelope was sealed. Inside was a folded set of papers, property transfer documents, and a short note. He made me sign this. Don't let him take everything. The signature at the bottom wasn't even close to her real one. It looked copied, uneven. I'd seen her sign her name thousands of times. She did it like an artist. Whoever did this hadn't even tried to make it believable. I sank into the couch, staring at the papers like they might start explaining themselves. Ethan's name appeared on every page, attached to legal forms transferring the deed to my mother's property land she'd owned for decades to Donovan Realty Group. My husband's company. He hadn't just skipped her funeral. He'd stolen from her before she even died. My hands shook so hard I dropped the papers. For a long moment, I just sat there, unable to breathe. Then I saw the edge of another paper underneath the couch, a receipt, dated 2 months earlier, for notarization services in Ethan's name. That was when the fear shifted into something colder, not panic clarity. I picked up the papers, slid them back into the envelope, and left the house without turning off the light. By the time I got home, it was nearly dawn. The house felt heavier than before, like it knew what I had just learned. Ethan still hadn't called. Not a text, not a word. I opened my laptop and searched fake signature legal penalty, Washington State. Reading through the laws, I realized this wasn't just a betrayal, it was a felony. My husband hadn't only cheated on me, he'd stolen from my family and used me to do it. The next morning, my phone buzzed again. Same number. My heart dropped before I even opened it. Don't tell anyone, it's not safe. That was the last message. For the first time, I noticed something strange. Both texts came from an old cell plan my mother canceled years ago. Someone had reactivated it or never deactivated it at all. I sat there in my kitchen, still in the same clothes from the night before, and realized there were only 2 explanations. Either someone was pretending to be my mother to scare me, or my mother wasn't dead. And somehow, both options felt terrifying. I spent the next hour replaying every detail of the last few months. Ethan handling the funeral arrangements, insisting on closing the casket before I could see her face. The rush to get the death certificate signed. The fact that he controlled all the paperwork, all the calls. Every memory twisted until it no longer felt like memory at all, it felt like a setup. Outside, the morning sun finally came up, but it didn't make the house brighter. It only made the lies easier to see. That was the moment I realized I couldn't face this alone anymore. Whatever had happened, whoever was sending those messages, someone wanted me to know something Ethan didn't want me to find. So I made coffee, opened my laptop again, and started a list of every person who'd ever worked with my mother. If the truth was buried, I was going to dig it up myself. And it started with finding one woman, the nurse, who was there the day my mother supposedly died. The first name on my list was Linda Carver, a retired nurse who used to work at Helen's Medical Center in Portland. She'd been my mother's friend for years, the kind who sent birthday cards and knew every gossip in the neighborhood. If anyone could tell me what happened that week, it would be her. I called the hospital first, pretending to be verifying paperwork for an insurance claim. They confirmed Linda had retired 3 years ago but gave me a forwarding number. When I called, she answered after one ring. Her voice was calm but cautious, like someone who'd learned to be careful about strangers. Linda? This is Claire Donovan, Margaret Ellis's daughter. The silence on the other end lasted long enough for me to wonder if the line had dropped. Then she exhaled. Claire, honey, I was wondering when you'd call. It wasn't the response I expected. My stomach tightened. You knew I'd call? Yes, she said softly. Because your mother told me you would once you saw the papers. Oh! I gripped the phone tighter. You've spoken to her? Recently? She's safe, Linda said, her tone steady but urgent. That's all I can say on the phone. If you want answers, come to my house. But don't tell anyone you're coming, especially not your husband. That last sentence told me everything I needed to know about whose side she was on. Linda lived on the outskirts of Salem, in one of those quiet neighborhoods with long driveways and mailboxes that hadn't been painted in decades. When I pulled up, she was already standing outside, wearing a blue cardigan and holding a thermos like she'd been waiting. She led me into her living room, lined with photographs and lace curtains that smelled faintly of cinnamon. I didn't even sit before she said, "Your mother didn't die, Claire." Ethan made sure everyone believed she did. The words landed like a slap. My brain refused to process them. That's impossible. I saw the death certificate. You saw what he wanted you to see, Linda interrupted. The hospital paperwork was real enough to fool anyone, but I never signed off on her death. I was her attending nurse that night. And your mother? She was very much alive when they wheeled her out. My knees felt weak, so I Saturday. Why would she let him do that? Why not come to me? She tried, Linda said, pulling a small folder from under her coffee table. But he threatened her, said if she didn't sign the property transfer, he'd go after you. He had her cornered emotionally and financially. When she realized he wouldn't stop, she decided to disappear. It was the only way to keep you safe until she could gather proof. I opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of emails, bank transfers, and handwritten notes. Ethan's name was everywhere, his signature on legal drafts, his company's letterhead on deeds, his assistant's initials confirming document delivery, end. The final page was a screenshot of an internal message from Donovan Realty Group. Vanessa's name appeared next to it. Client assets moved under private trust. Confirmed Margaret Ellis documentation completed. ER. My chest tightened so hard I had to stand. He used his company to launder the transfer. He turned my mother's land into collateral for his own projects. Linda nodded. That's what Margaret wanted you to find. But she's been hiding ever since staying with an old friend by the coast. She's afraid of being found. I paced the room, trying to breathe. Every detail of my marriage began rearranging itself into a different story, one where I was just another asset he managed. I turned to Linda. Can you take me to her? She hesitated, then handed me a slip of paper with an address written in faded ink. You'll find her here, but promise me something. Don't tell Ethan you know. I made Ethan. The drive to Oregon's coast felt heavier than the one to Portland. My mother wasn't dead, but somehow that truth hurt more than losing her. Because now I had to accept that she'd been forced to vanish, and I'd been blind enough to help the man who did it. When I reached the small coastal town of Newport, the address led me to a weathered house sitting high on a hill overlooking the gray Pacific. I parked, walked up the steps, and before I could knock, the door opened. She stood there. Older, thinner, but unmistakably her. Mom! She didn't speak at first. She just reached out and touched my face, like she was afraid I'd disappear if she blinked. Then she whispered, I'm sorry, Claire. I didn't want you to live through this part. The tears came before I could stop them. Why didn't you tell me? Why fake your death? She motioned me inside and closed the door behind us. Because he was watching everything. He controlled your accounts, your phone, even the funeral arrangements. If I'd tried to contact you, he would have destroyed both of us. I sank into a chair, shaking. He forged your signature. I know. I watched him do it. Her voice didn't tremble. It broke something deeper in me. She explained how Ethan had visited her under the guise of helping with estate planning, only to pressure her into signing the transfer. When she refused, he brought in documents she didn't understand, already notarized. He said if I didn't sign, you'd lose everything, she said quietly. So I signed something else, instead a statement with Linda and a lawyer friend. It's all here. She handed me another folder, thicker than the one before. Inside were photocopies, receipts, and one last handwritten note from her. This isn't about revenge, it's about truth. If he thinks we're silent, he wins. On. The clock ticked softly between us. Outside, waves crashed against the rocks below, steady and unbothered. For the first time in months, I didn't feel broken. I felt awake. My mother looked at me, eyes tired but determined. You can't go back to Seattle yet, not until you have everything you need to expose him. I took her hand. Then we start tonight. The night air at the coast was cold enough to sting, but I didn't feel it. I sat at my mother's small kitchen table, surrounded by folders, receipts, and legal papers that smelled faintly of coffee and salt. She moved slowly around the room, pouring tea like she'd done 1,000 times when I was a kid, except now her hands trembled just enough to give her fear away. You've been living here all this time? I asked. Since the funeral, she said. Linda helped me get here. I had to disappear before Ethan realized I wasn't going to stay silent. Ever 19. I took a sip of tea that tasted like guilt. You really think he would have hurt you? She looked up, her expression flat. He already did. That shut me up. She reached for a worn leather notebook from the counter and slid it toward me. Inside were detailed notes, dates, calls, transactions, even the names of Ethan's business partners. She'd written everything down, in her neat, careful handwriting, like a witness building her own defense. He used my land as collateral for his new project, she said. That's why he needed my signature. I didn't know until Linda showed me the loan filings. He'd been planning it for months, right under your nose. I ran my finger over the page where his name appeared again and again. Ethan Donovan. The letters looked almost arrogant in print, like they knew they could get away with anything. I flipped another page. These amounts, this isn't small money, Mom. This is fraud. Federal-level fraud. Have her. She nodded. That's why I had to vanish. If he thought I was alive, he'd find me and force me to sign more documents. Or worse. Her voice cracked for the first time. I didn't want to be another problem you had to solve. It hit me then how deep his manipulation ran. He hadn't just stolen from her. He'd turned her silence into a weapon against both of us. I pushed the notebook toward her. We're not hiding anymore. You did your part. Now it's my turn. She gave me a tired smile. You sound just like your father. We stayed up most of the night sorting through everything she'd collected. There were bank transfers, real estate deeds, notarized statements that didn't belong to her, and even screenshots of Ethan's company emails that Linda had printed before retiring. Every piece told the same story, a man who thought no one would notice because everyone he hurt was too polite to fight back. When dawn started creeping in, I noticed something in the corner of one page, a small set of initials next to Ethan's, V. R. Vanessa Reed, I said quietly. My mother nodded. His assistant. She handled the notary appointments and filed the transfers. She was at my house the day he brought the papers. That detail burned itself into my mind. Vanessa hadn't just been a mistress, she'd been an accomplice. I turned to my mother. Do you trust the lawyer who helped you write that statement? Yes, she said. Her name's Erin Walters. We used to teach together before she switched careers. She's tough. You'll like her. By the time I left the house that morning, the ocean was silver and restless. I drove to a nearby motel, showered, and called Erin. Her voice came through the speaker sharp, direct, the kind of tone that belonged to someone who knew how to win. Claire Donovan, she said. Your mother told me this day might come. Where are you? Oregon coast. I've got everything, documents, transfers, evidence. Ethan used her property for a loan. He forged my signature, too. She didn't sound surprised. Of course he did. That's what men like him do when they think charm is a business model. Listen, don't contact him yet. We'll move carefully. Can you meet me in Portland tomorrow? Yes. Good. Bring copies of everything. And Claire, don't talk to anyone from his company. Not even the bank. The first person who needs to hear from you is me. After the call, I sat on the motel bed, watching raindrops slide down the window. The timeline was clearer now. Ethan's trip to Hawaii wasn't a coincidence. He'd arranged the funeral, made sure the casket stayed closed, and staged the paperwork. The moment my mother died, he'd already been in paradise celebrating the win. It was methodical, cruel, and it meant he was confident no one could touch him. When I finally drove back toward the coast, the thought kept circling in my head: Ethan didn't just cheat in marriage. He cheated the law, and that meant the only way to win was to play smarter. Back at the house, my mother was asleep on the couch, her notebook still open beside her. I sat quietly and flipped through the last few pages. That's when I found something new, a small envelope tucked between two sheets. Inside was a bank statement addressed to Donovan Realty Group, Private Holdings Division. The date was recent. The transfer showed $90,000 moved from our joint account into one under Vanessa Reed's name. The memo line simply read, "Partnership Seed." I laughed. A quiet, humorless laugh that felt more like breathing out fury. He'd stolen money from me too, and labeled it partnership. The irony was so clean it almost impressed me. I slipped the papers into my own folder, stood up, and looked out toward the ocean. My mother stirred slightly, but didn't wake. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel like I was drowning. Somewhere out there, Ethan was still smiling for cameras, pretending to be the perfect husband in some resort or business dinner. He had no idea the woman he buried and the wife he betrayed were both still breathing. The next morning, I packed everything into a single briefcase. I kissed my mother on the forehead and told her to keep her phone off for a few days. She didn't argue. The road back to Portland was wet and empty, lined with mist that made the horizon disappear. But my mind wasn't foggy anymore. Every mile felt like another piece of fear burning away. By the time I reached the city, I wasn't a grieving wife anymore. I was a woman with proof. Aaron's office sat on the 10th floor of a downtown Portland building that smelled like ambition and espresso. Everything about her space was clean and deliberate dark wood, straight lines, no wasted words, no wasted time. She motioned for me to sit, then pushed a legal pad toward me. "Tell me everything," she said. I did. I told her about the funeral, the texts, the house, my mother, the fake documents, and the notebook full of transactions. Erin didn't interrupt. She just wrote in neat, slanted handwriting, while her eyes tracked every word I said like a cross-examiner waiting for a crack. When I finished, she exhaled and said, "You know, most people would have called the cops." "I didn't know who to trust," I said. "He has friends everywhere. Bankers, lawyers, even the press. He plays the perfect husband in public." "Of course he does," she said, flipping her pen. "Men like Ethan are experts at presentation. It's how they hide theft behind smiles. You said you brought evidence?" I slid the folders across the desk. She skimmed through them, page by page, her expression tightening. "This isn't just spousal fraud," she said finally. "It's financial deception, property coercion, and identity misuse. If we handle this right, he'll never work in real estate again." Hearing that should have made me feel better. It didn't. I felt like I was watching someone describe a crime scene I'd lived in for years without noticing. Aaron leaned forward. "Tell me about Vanessa Reed." I frowned. "His PR assistant. Or mistress. Probably both. She's in all of these documents. See?" She pointed at the bottom of a page. Her initials are next to every notarized line. That means she was present for every signature, including the forged ones. That makes her complicit. I stared at the paper, tracing Vanessa's tiny initials. She'd smiled at me at company events, complimented my dresses, and even brought flowers after my mother's passing. I remembered her hugging me, whispering, "Ethan's been so worried about you." The hypocrisy stung like acid. Aaron snapped a few photos of the papers and handed them back. "Here's what we'll do. I'll file a quiet discovery request to verify the loan attached to your mother's property. Once we confirm the fraud, we contact the IRS and Federal Property Division. But before that, we need proof of intent emails, transfers, anything that shows this wasn't a mistake." "I have access to our home office," I said. "He keeps everything digital. Passwords are saved on his desktop. He's careless when he feels invincible." Aaron gave a short nod. "Good. Don't move too fast, though. He'll notice if you start acting different. You'll play the perfect wife a little longer." That part was easy. I'd been doing it for years. The drive back to Seattle was long enough to plan every step. I'd go home, act normal, find the files, and copy everything to a hidden drive. The rain followed me the whole way, steady, relentless, cleansing. When I got home, Ethan was there. Of course he was. Standing in the kitchen, shirt sleeves rolled up, like he hadn't been publicly exposed for skipping my mother's funeral. He smiled. "Hey babe, you okay? You've been quiet since the funeral. I thought you might want to talk." The casual tone almost made me laugh. He said it like the only problem between us was a forgotten anniversary. "I'm fine," I said, setting my purse down. "Just tired." He poured himself a drink. "You know, Hawaii was," clarifying. "I realized I've been working too hard. Maybe we should take a trip somewhere, reset." I looked at his drink, then at him. "You think a vacation fixes everything?" He smiled like he always did when I asked questions that made him uncomfortable. "Claire, life doesn't stop for grief. Your mother would want you to move forward." He didn't even flinch when he said her name. The same mouth that forged her signature could say it like a prayer. I nodded slowly. "You're right, she'd want peace." That night, while he snored beside me, I slipped out of bed and went to his office. The password to his computer was still his favorite golf course. He'd never changed it. His desktop was chaos, folders labeled clients, investors, PR drafts. One caught my eye, Ellis Ridge Project, my mother's name. Inside were spreadsheets, loan agreements, and an email chain between Ethan and Vanessa. "Ethan, once the deed transfer clears, we'll use the land as leverage for the California expansion. No one will question the timing." Vanessa. "And the wife?" "She's emotional but predictable. She won't check a thing." Ethan. "Good. Keep it that way." Predictable. That word hit like a blade. I copied everything to a USB drive, checked twice that I hadn't left traces, and tucked it into a small jewelry box inside my nightstand. In the morning, he was gone before I woke up, just like always. I brewed coffee, opened my laptop, and sent Aaron an encrypted email. "I have the proof. Meet me tomorrow." At noon, I drove to the bank to check our joint account. The number glowed back at me, 0. Every dollar gone. The account had been drained overnight. For a moment, I just stared. Then it clicked. He'd moved the money before I could. He'd sensed something. Maybe not everything, but enough to act first. The banker's polite voice barely registered. "Mrs. Donovan, would you like to file a report?" I smiled, though it felt like a reflex. "No," I said. "Not yet." Because the one thing Ethan didn't know was that I already had everything he thought he'd hidden. I walked out into the drizzle, clutching my coat, and for the first time, I didn't feel small. The man who thought he'd buried my mother and broken me had just handed me the weapon that would end him, his own words. The wind picked up, and somewhere behind the clouds, I swore I could almost hear my mother's voice, calm, certain, unafraid. By the time I got back to Portland, the clouds looked heavier, like even the sky wanted in on what was coming. Erin was waiting at her office with 2 coffees and a stack of folders that looked like they could sink a ship. "Tell me you have something," she said. I dropped the USB drive on her desk. "I have everything." She plugged it in, scanned the files, and her eyebrows lifted. Emails, bank records, forged documents, and an internal memo naming Vanessa as a notary witness. "Claire, this isn't just evidence. This is a confession written in spreadsheets." Her tone stayed calm, but the glint in her eyes said she was already planning 5 steps ahead. I sank into the chair across from her. "What happens now?" She leaned back, folding her hands. "Now we decide how loud you want justice to sound." I looked out the window at the wet city streets. Loud enough for him to hear it from his glass office. She smiled. "Then we'll make it public but clean. No screaming, no drama. Just facts and signatures." Erin explained the plan like she'd done this 100 times, and I believed her. We'd file for financial discovery under my name, backed by my mother's notarized statement proving coercion. Once that hit the courts, the IRS and federal investigators would have to look into Ethan's company records. Every transaction he thought he'd hidden under development funds would unravel. But that was only half the plan. The other half was psychological. "We need him to think you've given up," she said. "Stay calm, play the supportive wife again. He'll drop his guard. And when he does, we hit him where it hurts the image." That part made sense. Ethan's entire empire was built on perception. charity galas, glossy magazine interviews, and the illusion of moral superiority. If I tore that down publicly, everything else would collapse behind it. Before I left, Aaron handed me a burner phone. Use this for everything from now on. If he's monitoring your calls or emails, we can't risk leaks. I drove home, the phone heavy in my hand. For years, I'd carried guilt like a wedding ring. Now it felt more like armor. When I walked into the house, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen island with his laptop, scrolling through headlines. One caught my eye, an article about him attending a charity auction that weekend. He looked up at me like nothing was wrong. "Hey, you look good," he said, smiling that politician's smile. "Thinking about coming to the gala with me this time?" I forced a soft laugh. "Maybe. If I can find a dress that makes me forget. I buried my mother last month." His smile faltered just enough to show the crack. Then he recovered. "Claire, it's been hard for both of us. I'm trying to move forward." "Of course you are," I said quietly, walking past him. "You always move forward, no matter who you step on." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. We both knew he'd already stepped on everyone. That night, I sat in bed, scrolling through Vanessa's social media. Her account had gone private after the Hawaii photos, but her profile picture was still there, standing next to Ethan, holding a champagne glass. Her smile looked forced, but maybe that was wishful thinking. I wasn't jealous. I was taking inventory. Every public post, every tagged photo, every location, each one was a breadcrumb. Aaron would call it digital due diligence. I called it knowing my enemy. The next morning, I met Aaron again. She'd already drawn up a timeline of events and cross-referenced them with the evidence. "We'll send the full package to the IRS and State Fraud Division by the end of the week," she said. "But there's one more move I want to make before we go nuclear." She handed me a printed RSVP form for the charity gala Ethan mentioned. "You're going?" I raised an eyebrow. "You want me to stand next to him in public?" "Exactly. You'll smile, take pictures, play the perfect wife. Meanwhile, our friends from the press will be there too. When they publish the story, it'll look like he had no idea what hit him. The public humiliation will make the legal fallout even worse." The plan was ruthless, but it was also poetic. Ethan had built his empire on optics. Now optics would destroy him. Aaron gave me a list of small tasks, quiet moves that seemed harmless on the surface but were designed to set everything in motion. I updated my passwords, secured my accounts, moved what little money I had left to a separate fund. Then she sent copies of the evidence to 3 people she trusted, each in a different city, each with instructions to release it if anything happened to me. By the time I drove home, I'd memorized every step. My hands didn't shake anymore. My voice didn't crack when I said his name. Ethan was in his office when I returned, on a call with someone from the company. I leaned against the doorway, waiting for him to finish. He hung up, smiling at me like nothing had ever happened. "You're quiet lately. Everything okay?" I smiled back. "Actually, yes. For the first time in a long time." He seemed relieved. "Good. I knew we'd get past this rough patch." He kissed my cheek before walking past me, and the scent of his cologne hit me like déjà vu. It was the same one he'd worn at my mother's funeral. When the door closed behind him, I walked straight to his desk, opened the drawer, and found the sealed envelope addressed to Private Legal Counsel. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I just slipped it into my coat pocket and left. That night, I sat in my car outside Aaron's office, staring at the city lights flickering through the rain. Every lie had a paper trail. Every betrayal had a timestamp. And now, every piece was finally in my hands. By the end of that week, the house didn't feel like home anymore. Every sound, a door closing, a phone buzzing, footsteps upstairs felt rehearsed, like we were 2 actors pretending to live a marriage that had already burned down. Ethan still moved through the rooms like he owned the air. I'd gotten good at matching his rhythm, smiling at the right times, asking just enough questions to sound believable. I started noticing. "You're calmer lately," he said one night while uncorking a bottle of wine. "That's good. You've been tense." I nodded, pouring myself a glass I had no intention of drinking. "I guess I realized some things aren't worth fighting anymore." He smiled, pleased with himself. "That's my wife, always practical." If only he knew how right he was about that. Erin had spent the last few days setting the stage for what she called the clean detonation. The IRS had quietly accepted her inquiry. The press contacts she'd fed evidence to were waiting for a trigger event, a moment that would make the story too explosive to ignore. That moment would be the upcoming dinner Ethan planned himself, a grand anniversary celebration for our 10 years of marriage. The irony was so sharp I almost admired it. The invitations went out with a gold embossed D for Donovan, held at the Silas, one of Seattle's most expensive private venues. The guest list read like a Forbes gala: business partners, investors, politicians, and PR executives. In short, everyone whose opinion Ethan lived for. When I first heard about it, Erin laughed. "He just scheduled his own execution," she said. The plan was simple but surgical. I'd go to the dinner, dressed like the woman he thought he'd broken. Calm, gracious, grateful. Our contact from the Seattle Journal, a journalist named Marcus Lee, would attend as a corporate sponsor. He'd have hidden cameras and a direct feed ready to go. Once Ethan started bragging about his new project, Ellis Ridge, built on stolen land, the footage would speak for itself. I spent the next 2 days pretending to care about floral arrangements and wine pairings. Vanessa, of course, was in charge of event coordination. Her emails were short and overly formal now, a far cry from the chirpy tone she'd used before Hawaii. It told me one thing she knew: Ethan was cracking under pressure. At night, I'd lie awake beside him, listening to the faint hum of his phone vibrating on the nightstand. Sometimes he'd sneak into his office to take calls. Sometimes he'd whisper, "I love you too," before hanging up. He didn't even bother changing his tone anymore. That was how sure he was that I'd never fight back. On the morning of the dinner, Erin met me at a small cafe a few blocks from the venue. She wore a gray coat, and that same calm expression that always made me feel steadier. "You know the sequence," she said. "You enter with him, stay close until the toast. Once he starts talking about the new project, Marcus will signal. You don't say anything, just let the truth roll out." I nodded, adjusting the bracelet she'd given me. Inside was a hidden microphone, synced to Marcus's recorder. "You think he'll talk that openly?" "Oh, he will," she said. "Men like him can't resist performing. Give him an audience, and he'll hand you the rope himself." I too knows. When I got home to get ready, Ethan was already dressed, looking every bit the perfect husband. Black tuxedo, polished shoes, cufflinks engraved with his initials. He handed me a small box. "For tonight." Inside was a diamond necklace. Beautiful, heavy, unnecessary. "It's been a rough year," he said, clasping it around my neck. "Let's show people we're stronger than ever." I caught my reflection in the mirror. The necklace glittered under the light, but all I saw was a chain. At the venue, cameras flashed as soon as we stepped out of the car. Ethan posed with that practiced confidence that made strangers believe he was born for attention. I smiled for the cameras, the perfect supporting role. Inside, the room glowed with warm gold light and expensive laughter. He spent the first hour mingling, shaking hands, trading charm for influence. I stayed close, listening. Every word he spoke was about expansion, innovation, vision. Every lie rolled out smoother than the wine. When the music quieted and the dinner began, Ethan stood for his toast. "Tonight marks 10 years of partnership, perseverance, and love," he said, flashing his most convincing smile. "And as we celebrate the future, I'm proud to announce our company's next chapter, Ellis Ridge. A development that represents everything this brand stands for: family, legacy, and trust." The room applauded. The word trust nearly made me laugh. Then came the moment Erin promised would come. Marcus, sitting near the back, raised his glass just slightly, our silent signal. Across the room, one of his associates adjusted his cuff, activating the feed. The LED behind Ethan lit up, cycling through project visuals until the image froze. The next slide wasn't a design rendering. It was a scanned document, the property transfer, with my mother's forged signature. A hush spread through the room like a crack in glass. Ethan froze mid-sentence, eyes narrowing. Another slide appeared, the email chain between him and Vanessa. Then another bank records, dated signatures, and his memo, "No one will question the timing." The applause stopped completely. Cameras from the press flickered to life. Vanessa stood near the catering table, her face draining of color. Ethan's smile cracked, then vanished altogether. "Turn that off," he barked. "That's not supposed to be." But it was. Every word, every file, every number was right there, in front of his investors, his friends, and the media that had built him up. I didn't say a thing. I didn't have to. The truth was louder than anything I could have planned. Ethan's voice turned desperate, reaching for damage control. "This is a mistake. A private matter taken out of context." The projector switched to a final slide, an image of my mother's property with the caption, "Ellis Ridge, built on a stolen foundation." The silence that followed was absolute. Ethan looked at me, eyes wide, voice breaking just slightly. "Claire, what did you do?" I lifted my glass and said, quietly enough for only him to hear, "What you taught me." I moved forward. And as the room erupted in chaos around him, cameras flashing, people whispering, investors walking out, I walked straight past the man who thought he owned my life, the diamond necklace glinting like a badge of irony under the chandelier. There was no ending in that moment, just the beginning of accountability taking shape in real time. The next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Notifications stacked like a heartbeat gone wrong. Emails, messages, missed calls, everything lighting up at once. It took me a second to realize why. Then I saw it. The video from the gala. Marcus had sent me the link at 5 a.m. The headline read, "Real estate mogul exposed at charity gala, wife uncovers $8 million fraud." Ho! The footage was everywhere. YouTube, morning news, even the national networks had picked it up. The clip showed Ethan smiling through his speech, then freezing as the forged documents appeared behind him. His voice, trying to salvage control, was clear over the microphone. "This is a private misunderstanding." The room's silence afterward said everything. Within hours, the comments exploded. "She's a legend." "He's done for." "Justice served in real time." I didn't post a thing. I didn't need to. The truth had already taken its place. Erin called around 7. "You might want to stay off your phone for a while," she said, half laughing, half warning. "You've gone viral." And the IRS called. "They're moving fast. They've frozen his corporate accounts and are reviewing every asset transfer tied to Ellis Ridge." I leaned against the kitchen counter, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "So, it's real now." "Oh, it's very real," Erin said. "The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit is coordinating with state investigators. They'll go through everything. Ethan's name is about to become a headline in every major paper for all the wrong reasons." Outside, the rain was falling again, light, cold, and clean. The kind of rain that makes the city look washed of its lies. Around noon, Ethan finally called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. His voice was hoarse, shaky. "Claire, you've made your point. Congratulations. You embarrassed me in front of everyone." "I didn't embarrass you," I said quietly. "You did that yourself." "This isn't over," he snapped. "You think you're some kind of hero? You just destroyed our life, Claire, everything I built." I let the silence stretch long enough for him to hear it. "You didn't build anything," I said finally. "You stole it from my mother, from your investors, from me." "Austing," he cursed under his breath, then lowered his voice to something I hadn't heard before: desperation. "Claire, listen to me. We can fix this. I'll step down for a while, lay low, let it pass. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding. You'll be taken care of. I'll make sure of it." "I don't want your money," I said. "I want my name back, my mother's name." He went quiet for a beat. Then he said something soft, almost pleading. "Please, Claire, don't let them put me in jail." End of quote. That was the moment I realized he wasn't scared of losing me. He was scared of losing power. "I didn't do this to hurt you, Ethan," I said. "I did it to stop you." He hung up without another word. By evening, the press had surrounded his office building. Reporters stood outside his glass headquarters as federal agents carried boxes of files into unmarked vans. The same employees who once worshipped him now turned their badges in quietly. Vanessa's statement hit the news next. She claimed Ethan had manipulated her, that she had no idea about the forged documents. Erin smirked when she saw it on TV. "She's running for cover. Typical." 2 days later, a photo appeared online. Ethan being escorted out of his office in handcuffs, jaw clenched, eyes hollow. The caption read, CEO Ethan Donovan arrested for financial fraud and property forgery. The video clip from the gala had already reached 10 million views. People dissected every frame, every look, every moment I didn't speak. Some called it poetic, some called it brutal. All I knew was that it was over. That night, I sat on the back porch with a blanket over my shoulders, watching the rain hit the wooden deck. My phone buzzed again, this time a message from an unknown number. Unknown. You won, Claire. Me. No. I just told the truth. Aaron arrived an hour later with 2 cups of coffee and that same tired smile. You okay? I don't know yet, I admitted. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels empty. That's what real justice feels like, she said. It's quiet. It's not about cheering or revenge. It's about knowing the story finally matches the truth. We sat there a while, listening to the rain, neither of us saying much. The next morning, news broke that Ethan's assets had been officially seized. His company, Donovan Realty Group, was being dismantled under federal supervision. Every contract, every false claim, every hidden fund exposed. Audrey from accounting was on TV, crying about how she'd lost her job but not her respect. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ethan had built an empire on other people's backs. Now they were walking away free while he faced what he'd earned. When the reporters came to my door, I said nothing. Aaron handled them all, releasing one short statement. Claire Donovan chose truth over silence. That's all there is to say. End quote. The world moved on faster than I expected. Scandals don't last forever. New ones come to take their place. But this one stayed just long enough to undo everything Ethan had built. Weeks passed. The house grew quieter, lighter. The necklace he'd given me at the gala sat in a drawer, untouched, a reminder of how pretty lies can look under chandelier light. One afternoon, I drove to my mother's old house. It was empty now, but the garden had started to bloom again. Daisies her favorite. I knelt by the fence, letting the damp soil sink into my hands, and for the first time in months, I let myself cry. Not from anger, just release. The phone buzzed again, Aaron's message. FBI concluded. Case closed. He's facing 20 years. I read it once, then looked up at the gray sky. The air smelled like rain and new beginnings. For the first time since that phone call from the hospital, I felt peace, not because I'd won, but because the truth had finally stopped hiding. Somewhere out there, the video was still being shared. The moment he fell, the moment silence turned into justice, and I realized maybe that was enough. The silence didn't last long. A week after the arrest, there was a knock on my door, sharp, desperate, familiar. I already knew who it was before I opened it. Ethan stood there, unshaven, wearing a wrinkled suit that looked borrowed. The confidence that used to fill every inch of him was gone. His eyes darted around like a man who'd lost his place in the world. Claire, he said, voice low. Please, just hear me out. I stepped aside without saying a word. Not out of sympathy, out of curiosity. I wanted to see what kind of man crawled out from under the wreckage. He sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where he'd once signed contracts worth millions. Now, his hands shook as he wrapped them around a glass of water. They froze everything, he said. The accounts, the assets, even my car. Vanessa's gone. She took whatever was left in her personal account and disappeared. That must be difficult, I said evenly. He looked up, searching for emotion in my face. You don't understand, Claire. I made mistakes, but I never meant to hurt you. Or your mother. I raised an eyebrow. You forged her signature, Ethan. You faked her death. You stole her land. Which part of that wasn't meant to hurt me? He ran a hand through his hair, defeated. It wasn't supposed to go that far. The investors, they pressured me. I thought if I could just finish the project, we'd both benefit. I was trying to save us. Save us? I said quietly. You buried my mother alive and called it real estate. He flinched. The words hit him harder than I expected. He took a breath and leaned forward. You don't know what it's like to lose everything. I can't even walk into a coffee shop without people whispering. They think I'm some monster. Ender. I tilted my head slightly. That's not what they think, Ethan. That's what they know. He stared at me for a long time before saying, almost to himself, "You enjoyed it, didn't you? Watching me fall." I shook my head. "No, I didn't enjoy it. I just stopped protecting someone who didn't deserve protection." He pushed back his chair, his voice cracking. "You think this makes you better than me? You think your silence makes you noble?" "No," I said calmly. "It makes me free." Ender 2. The look in his eyes shifted anger, confusion, maybe envy. "You'll regret this, Claire. They'll dig into everything. You think the world's going to keep cheering for you? They'll move on. You'll be yesterday's story." "Good," I said. "I never wanted to be a story." He stood up, pacing the room like a man cornered by his own reflection. "I loved you," he said suddenly, almost shouting. "You were my wife. Doesn't that mean anything?" I looked at him for a long moment. "It used to. Until you showed me what love looks like when it's mixed with greed." He froze. For a second, I thought he might hit the table or throw something. Instead, he just deflated like air leaking from a balloon. When he finally spoke again, his voice was a whisper. "What do I do now?" I took a step toward him, my tone steady. "You face what you did, and you stop pretending it was love." He nodded slowly, almost as if accepting a verdict. Then he turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "You're stronger than I ever thought you were." "I always was," I said. "You just never looked long enough to see it." He left without another word. When the door closed, the house went still again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet as before. This one felt earned. Later that night, Aaron called. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, staring at the spot where he'd been standing. "He came by. He's broken." "He'll stay that way for a while," Aaron replied. "That's what happens when people finally run out of lies." There was a pause. "You did the right thing, Claire." "I know," I said softly. "But the right thing doesn't always feel good." She sighed. "No, but it lasts." After the call, I walked to my mother's studio, the one room I hadn't touched since she passed. Her old easel was still there, paintbrushes stiff with dried color, the faint smell of turpentine lingering in the air. On the table sat a half-finished canvas, covered in dust. It was a painting of the sea gray and restless, but with a single line of light breaking through the clouds. I ran my fingers along the edge and smiled. She always said, "You can't stop storms, but you can paint them into something that makes sense." Outside, thunder rolled over the city. Somewhere downtown, the remnants of Ethan's company were being boxed up and labeled evidence. He'd built an empire on borrowed names and stolen signatures. Now, every document had my mother's handwriting stamped across it, proof that even the dead can testify. I sat down in her old chair and picked up one of her brushes. The bristles were rough, but they still worked. I dipped it into a jar of blue paint and made a single stroke across the canvas, cutting through the gray. It felt like breathing again. Hours passed without me noticing. When I finally looked up, dawn had started to break through the window, soft, quiet, and painfully honest. That was the thing about truth. It doesn't always arrive with fanfare or applause. Sometimes it just shows up in the morning light, steady and undeniable, after a long night of noise. And in that silence, I realized something simple but absolute. The past doesn't knock forever. Eventually, it runs out of doors to pound on. The morning the verdict came, the city was wrapped in fog, thick, pale, and quiet, like it already knew what was about to happen. Erin picked me up outside my house, her coffee cup steaming between her fingers. She didn't say much on the drive to the courthouse. Neither of us did. Some moments don't need words. When we arrived, the press was already there. Cameras lined the steps like vultures waiting for a signal. Ethan came out of a black sedan, flanked by two lawyers in dark suits. His hair was shorter, his face thinner. For the first time, he looked small, not because of the cuffs on his wrists, but because there was nothing left for him to hide behind. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy. The judge, an older man with calm eyes, shuffled through his notes before looking up. "In the case of the United States versus Ethan Donovan," he began, "this court has reached its decision. Every sound in the room seemed amplified: the scratch of a pen, the creak of a chair, even the slow inhale from Ethan's defense attorney. "The defendant," the judge continued, is found guilty of financial fraud, property forgery, and perjury. Sentencing, 20 years federal prison with no possibility of early release. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Ethan didn't move. He just stared straight ahead, expressionless, until the bailiff touched his arm. That small gesture broke him. His shoulders slumped, his eyes flicked briefly toward me. There wasn't hatred there, not anymore. Just the hollow understanding of a man who finally realized the cost of everything he'd built. Aaron leaned over and whispered, "It's over." But it didn't feel like victory. Not exactly. It felt like the sound of something finishing that should have ended long ago. When we walked outside, the reporters swarmed. Microphones pushed forward, flashes went off, and questions came from every direction. "Mrs. Donovan, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you have any statement for the public? Will you rebuild your company?" I stopped just long enough to say, "Justice doesn't need noise. It just needs truth." Then I kept walking. By the afternoon, the story was everywhere again, headlines calling me the quiet widow who brought down an empire. They made it sound cinematic, but the truth was simpler. I wasn't out for revenge. I was out for clarity. That night, I drove to the coast. The one place that still felt untouched by lies. The sky was pale pink, fading to gray, waves folding against the rocks in slow rhythm. I stood near the edge where the wind could cut through my thoughts. In my hand, I held the necklace Ethan had given me, the same one he clasped around my neck before his downfall began. It sparkled under the last bit of daylight, perfect and cold. I unclasped it, let it rest on my palm, and whispered, "This was never love. It was a receipt." Then I threw it into the sea. It vanished almost instantly, swallowed by the water without ceremony. The sound of it hitting the waves was quieter than I expected. But maybe that's how justice always lands, not loud, just permanent. When I got back to my car, Aaron had texted, "You did the impossible. Sleep easy tonight." For the first time in months, I thought maybe I could. Over the next few weeks, the noise around Ethan's case faded. His name became a headline buried beneath newer scandals. The world moved on, as it always does. I spent my days sorting through my mother's papers, the ones she'd kept hidden for years. Sketches, notes, letters. Among them, I found a folded piece of stationery with her handwriting. "The truth will always find its witness." I smiled. Maybe she'd always known I'd be the one to carry it. The next month, Aaron called with news. The restitution came through. The estate is officially yours again. And there's more, the court ordered full recovery of your mother's trust. Every cent. It took me a moment to process it. "You mean?" "Yes," Aaron said, her tone soft. "Everything he took is back in your name. You can rebuild if you want to." I thought about that for a while. Rebuild. The word sounded exhausting. What I wanted wasn't another empire, it was peace. I used part of the settlement to reopen my mother's old art studio, this time as a community space. We called it Atelier, after her maiden name. Women came in with stories of their own, some whispered, some loud, all real. The walls filled with paintings, colors layered over pain, brushstrokes that looked like survival. One afternoon, a young woman stood in front of a canvas and said, "You don't act like someone who destroyed a man like that." I laughed softly. "I didn't destroy him. I just stopped protecting him." She smiled like she understood. Maybe she did. Later that night, as the last light faded, I sat by the window overlooking the ocean. The studio was quiet, except for the sound of brushes being rinsed in water. Outside, the sea stretched endless, the same one that had swallowed the necklace, now glittering with calm reflections. I thought about Ethan in prison, how silence must sound different when you can't control it anymore. Maybe he'd finally learned what it meant to face himself. Maybe not. It didn't matter. The story wasn't about him anymore. It was about the women who came into that studio and found their voices again. It was about my mother's words living on through every brushstroke. It was about truth outlasting everything that tried to bury it. As I turned off the lights, I caught a glimpse of the ocean, through the glass, steady, unbothered, infinite. For the first time, I felt something close to peace. Not the kind that hides from pain, but the kind that comes after you've faced it and survived. Justice, I realized, doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it just whispers, "You're free now." By spring, the sea had claimed every trace of winter. The mornings were filled with salt air and the soft hum of waves brushing against the rocks outside my new home. A small white cottage beside the art studio I'd reopened. The sign on the front door read Ellis Atelier, for women finding their voice. It wasn't a business. It was a refuge. Every week, women from across Oregon would arrive, teachers, nurses, mothers, even a few corporate executives who'd traded power suits for paint-stained aprons. Some had lost marriages. Others had lost themselves. We didn't talk much about the men who hurt us. We didn't have to. The silence between us said enough. In the corner of the studio hung my mother's last unfinished painting, the one she'd started before Ethan forced her to sign those papers. I'd refused to touch it. The brushstrokes were hers, uneven, imperfect, beautiful. A reminder that not everything broken needs fixing. One afternoon, a soft knock sounded at the door. When I opened it, a teenage girl stood there, holding a sketchbook tight to her chest. She couldn't have been more than 16. "Hi," she said quietly. "My mom said you let people paint here, even if they don't know what they're doing." I smiled. "That's the only rule. No experience required." She hesitated before walking in, glancing around at the canvases filled with color and chaos. "My dad's not around anymore," she said softly. "Mom says I should find something that helps me stop hating him." I nodded toward an empty easel. "Then you're in the right place." For the next few hours, she painted messy streaks of blue and black that eventually turned into something resembling a storm. When she finished, she stepped back and said, "I think it's supposed to be over now." Loud. "It is," I told her. That evening, after everyone left, I stood by the window watching the waves. The sky was a soft gold, fading to pink, the same colors my mother used in her best works. For the first time, I understood why she always painted the horizon. It's where endings and beginnings look the same. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Aaron. He's been transferred to a minimum security facility in Eastern Washington. No parole for 12 years. Just thought you'd want to know. I stared at the message for a moment, then deleted it. I didn't need to know where Ethan was anymore. His absence was no longer something to track. It was just space, finally cleared for peace to live in. That night, I walked down to the shoreline barefoot, the sand cool under my feet. The moon was low, silvering the waves. Somewhere beneath them was the necklace I'd thrown, a piece of the past, now claimed by the ocean. I liked thinking it stayed there, at the bottom, where light couldn't reach, but movement never stopped. Grief and peace share that same rhythm. They don't disappear. They just learn to breathe underwater. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of paint and sea salt from the studio. I closed my eyes and heard my mother's voice again, the one that used to guide me through everything. "Don't fight the storm, Claire. Just make sure when it passes you've still got your canvas." End of teen. The next morning, I unlocked the studio early. The teenage girl had returned, this time with her mother. They painted side by side, laughing quietly as the light poured in through the windows. I didn't join them. I just watched. Watching was enough. Later that afternoon, a journalist from the Seattle Journal stopped by. Marcus Lee, the same one who had recorded Ethan's downfall. He smiled when he saw me. "You've built something remarkable here," he said. "Would you be open to an interview? A follow-up on the story?" I shook my head gently. "The story's finished. The rest isn't for headlines." He nodded, understanding immediately. "Then maybe it's not about the past," he said. "Maybe it's about what you're doing now." I considered that. "If it helps other women find their peace," I said, "then maybe." When he left, I walked to the back of the studio and picked up one of the smaller brushes. I hadn't painted since that night months ago. The blank canvas in front of me felt both heavy and inviting. I dipped the brush into a soft mix of blue and gold and began to paint a coastline wide, endless, and calm. As I worked, I realized I wasn't painting grief anymore. I was painting proof. Proof that life doesn't end where betrayal begins. It just changes its form. By evening, the studio was filled with soft light and quiet laughter from the last few women packing up their things. One of them turned to me and said, "You know, when I first came here, I thought revenge was what I needed. but I think what I really wanted was peace. I smiled. They're not opposites, I said. One just takes longer to find. After they left, I locked the door and walked outside. The ocean stretched in front of me, steady and endless. The sun had dipped below the horizon, but the afterglow lingered, that stubborn kind of light that refuses to die even when the day is gone. I stood there for a long time, letting the breeze carry away the last fragments of everything that used to weigh me down. The truth had done its job. Justice had spoken. The lies were buried, the storm had passed, and what remained was mine. Not the ruins of a marriage, but the foundation of a life rebuilt on dignity. As I turned back toward the cottage, the studio lights flickered behind me, warm, alive, and certain. And in that glow, I found the only ending that ever really mattered. Peace that didn't need forgiveness, just freedom. A year passed quietly, the way healing often does, without applause, without anyone noticing except me. The sea still greeted me every morning, the air still smelled like salt and paint, and the world kept spinning in its ordinary rhythm. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for anything. The Ellis Atelier had grown beyond what I'd ever planned. It wasn't just a studio anymore. It had become a sanctuary. Women from across the country sent letters and photos of their art. Some even drove hours just to sit by the window where my mother once painted. They said this place reminded them that peace wasn't something you waited for, it was something you built. One morning, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper, handwritten in familiar cursive. You were right. I spent my life chasing power, and when I finally had none, I understood what freedom really meant. Take care of yourself, Claire. You won't hear from me again. It wasn't signed, but I didn't need it to be. I stood there for a long time, reading those words again and again. Not out of pity, out of closure. That letter was Ethan's last transaction, and this time, I didn't owe him anything in return. Later that week, Erin came by with a bottle of wine. She looked at the ocean and said, "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd stayed silent?" I smiled. All the time, and every time, I thank myself for not doing it. She raised her glass. To peace, then. To truth, I said. We sat on the porch, watching the tide pull in and out, talking about everything except the past. That's how I knew I was finally free from it, when it stopped needing to be the subject of every conversation. That summer, the Seattle Journal ran a feature about Ellis Atelier. Marcus Lee titled it, "The Woman Who Turned Betrayal into Art." He'd visited a few times, quietly observing the women who came here, the way they painted their pain into something worth looking at. When the article came out, my inbox filled with messages from women who said the story gave them the courage to leave, to speak, to rebuild. I didn't respond to most of them. I didn't need to. I just hoped they'd find their own version of the sea, that steady rhythm that reminds you everything painful eventually ebbs. One afternoon, I stood in front of my mother's unfinished painting, the one I'd never touched. The canvas had faded slightly, the edges fraying with time, but the light she painted still shimmered beneath the dust. For the first time, I picked up a brush and added one final stroke, a thin beam of gold cutting through the clouds, stretching toward the horizon. Not to change her work, but to complete it. It felt like saying goodbye. A few weeks later, Erin and I hosted a small exhibition at the studio, not for profit, just to celebrate the women who'd found themselves again. The walls were covered with stories told in color, reds for anger, blues for calm, yellows for rebirth. When people walked through, they didn't just see paintings, they saw the proof that survival could be beautiful. As the evening went on, a woman in her 50s approached me. She had silver hair, tired eyes, and a kind smile. "I watched your story last year," she said softly. "The one about your husband. I left mine the next day. I didn't have a plan, but I had courage. Thank you for giving me that." I felt my throat tighten. "You did that yourself," I said. "All I did was show you what's possible." After the guests left, the studio was silent again, the kind of silence that doesn't ache anymore. I stood by the window, looking at the reflection of the ocean under the moonlight. The water glowed faintly, endless, and calm. I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago, standing alone at my mother's funeral, humiliated, broken, believing that silence was safety. If I could have spoken to her then, I would have told her this. You don't have to shout to be strong. Sometimes, calm is the loudest sound in the room. The wind brushed through the open door, carrying the faint smell of jasmine from the garden. I turned off the lights and stepped outside, feeling the wooden boards cool beneath my bare feet. The stars were bright that night, not dramatic, just quietly certain. I walked down to the water's edge, where the waves rolled in soft and steady. For a moment, I imagined my mother standing there beside me, her hand on my shoulder, her smile calm and knowing. See, I whispered. We made it. End of T9. The water lapped against my ankles, gentle and cold, like it was agreeing. Freedom, I realized, wasn't loud or dazzling. It wasn't the grand finale of a story or a headline that went viral. It was standing barefoot by the sea, breathing without fear, and knowing you don't owe anyone an explanation for your peace. As the tide pulled back, I said the words out loud, not to the waves, not to the wind, but to myself. I'm free. And for the first time in my life, it wasn't something I needed to prove. It was just the truth. If this story touched you, don't forget to comment below, tell me where you're watching from, or if you've ever found your own quiet kind of victory. And if you love cheating stories, revenge stories, and family drama that end with truth and dignity, make sure to subscribe. There are more stories waiting, not about pain, but about strength.